Hey guys, I'm Jax and I just saw the new Godzilla film, Godzilla Minus One. Now let me tell you, this film is pretty much everything you could possibly want in a Godzilla film. You've got Godzilla destroying and wrecking shop. You've also got characters in the film that aren't Godzilla that are bearable enough that you don't continuously ask every time they're on screen, hey, where's Godzilla? What more do you want for a film about Godzilla? How about a film that deals with the horrors and tragedies of post-war for the individual and the country, but also there's a big Godzilla? How about a film that focuses on a coward who escaped his kamikaze mission and has to reconcile with the guilt of abandoning his duty and his honor, but also has to fight a big Godzilla? How about a film that is just so devastating and powerful and emotionally rich with all of the thematic elements it does on a character level? But also, you guessed it, Godzilla! Godzilla in this film is no savior of the people. He's not fighting other monsters and doing man's work against the other horrible beasts in this universe. This is no Hollywoodization of Godzilla that we've gotten in America in the last couple of Godzilla films. This is old school Japanese Godzilla. This guy's a big old meanie, a big bully, horrendous dinosaur-sized monster of doom and destruction, one might say. This guy sucks. This Godzilla, he's so intense. This Godzilla is scary. I found this Godzilla to be such a fascinating and complex thing of I loved seeing a big lizard on screen, walking about. He's got this kind of funny way of walking where he's just boom boom. And he's got this really interesting, unique feeling where it almost felt like they were how do we make CGI Godzilla look like a guy in a costume Godzilla, but still make it scary and menacing? He's just got such a formidable but kind of exciting, awe-inspiring vibe about him. But then every single second of the film, when Godzilla does a thing, which is mostly murder and eat and just kill everything, it is so horrifying. This film goes hard. All the human stuff essentially focuses on this one guy who was an ex-kamikaze pilot in World War II. The film is set just after World War II, and he is essentially kind of a coward. Someone who ran away from his post during the war and is constantly dealing with survivor's guilt, with dealing with the idea of being someone who was so filled with honor and duty, but abandoning all of that in the face of death and in the face of a potential Godzilla. So he's a coward twice over, and he has to kind of reckon with that throughout the whole film. And it's a really interesting and complicated and challenging main character for us to follow and sympathize with, but it's really, really fascinating. It's very intense. It's very sad. There is a couple of moments in the film where it's like there's some light humor and a bit of the side characters get occasional lines that are a bit humorous. And the awe-inspiring Godzilla stuff at times is kind of fun, but generally speaking, this film is harrowing. This film is heartbreaking. This film is really intense. It really feels like an anti-war, post-war film. All of the action and the devastation is very obvious what it's thematically kind of discussing and representing. It really was quite an intense film emotionally, just on a character level. This truly is a film that you want to see in the cinema. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Yeah, well, that's to be expected. It's got a big Godzilla destroying things. Of course, it's a big cinema experience. But it really had some truly wonderful moments in terms of cinematography, sound design, and visuals, and they all just created some of the most breathtaking / horrifying moments I've seen on screen in a very long time. The absolutely spectacular combination of really inventive and interesting visuals, cinematography, and the sound design of the build-up and then release, and then the aftermath of the first atomic breath, fire, shooting blue laser beams, or as they call it in the film, heat ray or whatever. The heat ray moment of Godzilla in this film, the very first one, is probably the best moment in a cinema I've experienced in so long. It is such a crazy and complex combination of just visually gorgeous and awe-inspiring and just super, super cool because a big lizard gets all blue and shoots laser beams out of its mouth. But then it shoots laser beams out of its mouth and it turns into this devastating, harrowing, horrifying moment. And it is just so well put together and crafted where it kind of does both of these very kind of contrasting and different emotions all in one big scene. It's easily the standout of the film. It is so powerful. It's so mesmerizing and shocking. It left me speechless. Like, I felt numb afterwards. I was overwhelmed. I think that represents what works about this film, where it so cleverly balances giving us that kind of fun, awesome, almost mildly goofy at times, just big Godzilla walking around. He's got a big tail, he's just smashing stuff, and he's wrecking shop. Godzilla's doing a big swim. You want to see a big lizard do a big swim for, like, ages? Like, this guy loves to get wet. And if I'm being honest, I also like to see Godzilla get wet. It just has so much fun. There's so many creative and interesting and beautiful visuals, but then it never loses sight of its main messaging of anti-war and trauma and survivor's guilt, and it's challenging and it's messy and it's dirty and all of these complicated, intense issues. There are some really harrowing, kind of beautiful but harrowing and poignant little moments of characters talking. The best parts of the film are undeniably when Godzilla is Godzillaing about. There is some truly great stuff. I think the first time we see him, I was like, okay. But then from the second time to the rest of the times, the best Godzilla stuff I've seen. Like, so very good. And we get enough Godzilla where you're never like, oh, it's an hour and a half of other people talking and just characters running about or whatever, and then like 5 minutes of Godzilla. Like, Godzilla feels like he's in enough of a movie called Godzilla, which I feel like I've had an issue with some other Godzilla films. But then it doesn't go too far the other way, where I've also had trouble with other Godzilla films where I'm like, maybe too much Godzilla. Maybe calm down with Godzilla, like maybe build up to it. So it finds this really interesting and perfect balance, but then all of the character stuff with the thematic elements that Godzilla kind of represents and brings into the story with our main characters is all very compelling, very interesting, and most importantly, like, quite thought-provoking and interesting and scary. It's an intense emotional film. I really liked what this film was saying and what it was attempting to tackle in its film, whilst also giving us all our Godzilla fun and mayhem. It's really strong. There are two things the film does towards the end where I'm like, I understand exactly where they're coming from and why they did them to contrast the rest of the film, but I feel like one works really well, even though the execution is kind of funny, and I'm like, oh, it's like that other film that also kind of does it in a silly way. And then the second one, you're kind of like, what? Enough tiptoeing around that. I want to discuss that properly, kind of get my thoughts out. So I'm going to do a little bit of a spoiler review of the last two moments of the film. But generally speaking, end of my spoiler-free review. It's a really good time. Also, it's a really sad time. It's a good Godzilla movie. If you just want to see Godzilla on about, you're going to get that. And if you're also going to want to have some horribly intense thoughts about war and the human experience and what it means to be a hero, this film also has it. It's so good. Alright, so let's talk spoilers. So at the end of the film, there is a moment where our main kamikaze pilot character is like, I'm going to get in this plane, I'm going to actually fulfill my kamikaze duties and do a big kamikaze into the Godzilla's mouth and explode it. And they're trying to do a whole big science where they're like, we'll compress and or maybe decompress, or we'll do some water compression-based science and push a Godzilla down, then push the Godzilla up. And they do that, and of course it fails because our main character has to do his kamikaze situation. And I understand, the whole film has had this really strong basis of Japan and the Japanese government and the war effort and all these things didn't value life. Like, the thematic ideas behind all of these decisions, I think, was really strong and compelling and interesting. All of that I liked, like, on a thematic, like, level. I loved it. Really powerful, really emotional. All of that worked. My issues kind of just come down to the execution of them and the kind of decision making of, like, how it's presented. Because we have a big speech by our science character, and if you're confused which one he was the science one, and not the one who wasn't a science one, or the one who was a young guy. He was the science one. Yeah, the side characters weren't as well fleshed out as they could have been, for sure. So the science guys are like, the government and Japan in general, they didn't value life in the war, so we want to do this mission and lose no lives. So that's like, thematically, it's like, okay, you've set that up, but this guy's still going to do a big kamikaze. And he's not going to kind of honor that kind of wanting to kind of win a fight to live on and not sacrifice themselves. And so it makes sense. I get it. But just the way they did it, where there's clearly like something written on his seat. Well, that's an ejector seat. This is a new fancy plane that they've built, but they never like took out into the war. So like it's got new functions, like maybe an ejector seat. So it just felt so obvious. And he like points to it, like our builder, our mechanic character, he like points to it, and then it cuts away in just such an ugly and awkward way where I was just like, oh yeah, the ejector seat. That wasn't very subtle, and I don't know how you do it. I think maybe you just have him explain it to the ejector seat, or you don't put that in. I don't know. It just felt really clunky and kind of a really messy and ugly kind of editing choice, because then later on, when he ejects and they're like, oh my god, he ejector seated, it's the guy he ejector seated. It cuts to the guy and he's like pointing, and then he's like, it's an ejector seat. And they just play out the scene, and I just felt it was so clunky. I don't know, it just didn't work for me. It felt really poorly structured, and like, it just felt so weird. It's also the exact same ending as The Dark Knight Rises. It's the same scene where it's like, there's no ejector seat. And then at the end of the movie, Lucius Fox is like, in like a montage, he's like, did you know there was an ejector seat? I think maybe somehow that's better, but maybe that's the Batman score. And I just love Batman so much. I'm just like, yeah, Batman escaped, because Batman always escapes or whatever. And I just don't want Batman to die, so maybe I'm more forgiving. And maybe I was a child when that movie came out. Who knows? Who knows? It just didn't work for me in this instance. I felt like it was so obvious it was going to happen. And then when it happened and it cut back to the scene, it wasn't like, oh, yes, he survived. He's going to survive like the other guy. It just, I don't know. It just kind of made the big emotional moment of him surviving fall a little flat due to the editing and the choices of where the scenes were played. I don't know. I feel like maybe it would have worked better if he's like, there's an ejector seat. And he's like, I'm not a coward. I'm not going to eject a seat. Like, what if I eject a seat and it misses the Godzilla and I run away as a coward and fail the war again? Like, and he's got reasons to not eject a seat, and yet in the moment he succeeds and ejects seats? I don't know. I just feel like there's something, like, I don't know. I don't have the perfect answer. I just feel like something in there could have made it work better, at least for me. The second issue I think I have more of an issue with, because I don't think it makes any sense and I don't think it works. Because that first thing, it's just how it's done. It's not that it's done. I want him to survive, hope, no sacrifice, win the war to live on after the war. Love all of it thematically. Beautiful, powerful, great stuff. At the end of the film, the lady friend survives, and she's got a couple of bruises and scratches, and maybe she's lost her eye. But I saw this movie, and that moment when Godzilla, boom, 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 explodes, atomic breath, the spikes come out, like, just so cool. I love how the spikes came out. So good. The sound design where everything built up, and then just eviscerated everything, and the aftermath and the shockwaves through everything. And there's that moment where they're both standing, and you can see that shockwave is going to knock them both back and kill them. And she pushes him behind a building, and the building doesn't fall, so he survives, but she gets thrown off camera, sure, so we don't exactly see what happens, which I guess means she survived, but she dies. She gets so killed, so hard. Like, I just feel like the shot they showed of her sacrificing herself was so overwhelming and so powerful, and it really affected me. It really upset me, because I would prefer her to survive than him, because he's continuously been a coward the whole film, and he keeps struggling with it. So of course he's going to keep surviving. This intense survivor's guilt is going to keep building. And all of that really, really works for me. And for someone to sacrifice themselves for him then reinforces how he's going to try and sacrifice himself at the end of the film, and kind of works up the courage to all these things that happened. And there's such a tragic, like, kind of twist to it all, because she clearly loves him, and he's clearly so brokenhearted and self-loathing, and he can't escape the war that's kind of never ended for him, and the trauma of being that coward and running away and kind of never escaping him. He can't kind of accept that love from her. And so her to sacrifice herself and die, it was all so very powerful and moving and heartbreaking and uncomfortable. And then at the end of the film, it's just like, oh, she also survived. How? I mean, don't think about it. She survived. Hope. And I understand it's kind of reinforcing that idea of hope that's kind of going on, and like no one dying, and that kind of that whole thing that makes sense that he survives, I feel like her surviving, it's just a little bit too much for me. And it's like, it's not a bad scene. It's an emotional scene where you're like, oh, that's nice for him. He just kind of rubbed me the wrong way where I'm like, I don't like it when a character has clearly died and you've emotionally tricked me into experiencing her death and the sorrow from her death and the emotional devastation from her death. And you've elicited all these emotions from me. And yes, it's meant to be like, oh, but she survived. Oh, you felt all that, but she survived. All this heartbreak and horror, the war, the World War II, all these things. But there's hope out of it. And I understand what they're going for, but for me, it felt kind of cheap. And I kind of wish he hadn't put it in the movie. I don't know. I feel a little heartless saying that. Saying, I wanted this character to die and stay dead. I just feel like it was more powerful because she didn't deserve to die. And she was a heroic and awesome character. And yeah, I don't know. It's not the biggest issue in the world, but I feel like it kind of detracted a lot of emotion for me because it felt like a very kind of fake, unearned, happy ending. Whereas him surviving with the parachute, despite the editing choices, I think emotionally worked and resonated with the themes of the movie. So it's really interesting to have these two survival moments, and one, whilst I don't think the execution worked, was really powerful and emotional and fits. The other one feels like too much put onto the end of this movie. But then the movie, it's like it almost knows that I'm like a little unhappy. And it's like, well, what if we give you one more character who isn't dead? And I'm like, oh God, okay, who? Oh, Godzilla? Oh no, I for some reason I'm okay with that because for some reason Godzilla like regenerates in this one. Maybe he does that in all of them. I don't know. I'm not a big Godzilla guy. I like big monsters, but I just haven't seen that many Godzilla films. But like there's a point where his face explodes and it all goes and it like reheals. And so you see the bubbly parts of Godzilla in the ocean like bubbling up and like reforming. And that made me hard. I was like, ooh yeah, more Godzilla? Yes, please.